There's a whole lot of story to unravel in the first chapter of Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden. In this video, I'll go over how we can make sure that the characters learn about and become engaged with the story or stories that Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden is trying to tell, as they go through the 10 towns in the first chapter of the book. In the last video, we went over the structure of Chapter 1 10 Towns. In this video, I want to build on that by also speaking about the story in Chapter 1 10 Towns, and most importantly, how we can bring the whole adventure story to life as the characters go through the 10 towns in the first chapter of the book. Story-wise, the most important thing we can do in the first chapter is to add in a lot of foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is simply when we hint at or give information about some of the locations, NPCs, and events that will come up later in the adventure. This could be having the characters run into a member of the Arcane Brotherhood, or hear about thieving Duergar from some of the locals in 10 towns, or perhaps meeting an awakened animal or one of Aurel's frost druids. These three are also the main storylines we want to include foreshadowing about in the first chapter: Aurel and her frost druids, Sardarok and his Duergar, and the Arcane Brotherhood and their search for Itherin. Now, the book does help us by providing some foreshadowing. The characters can hear about or meet frost druids in Bremen and Lonelywood. They can hear about or meet Duergar in Caer Dineval, Caer Konig, and Easthaven. And lastly, they can also meet or hear about members of the Arcane Brotherhood and their search for Itherin in Caer Dineval and Easthaven. Now, there's two issues with the way the foreshadowing is set up in Chapter 1 10 Towns. First off, because the chapter is so open, the characters may not even encounter any of this foreshadowing, or at least not all of it. We can help this by structuring the chapter as described in the previous video, making it more likely that they will run into the more important story points. But in any event, there's no guarantee that they will hear about the most important things we want them to hear about in the chapter. Secondly, these three stories are presented mostly as individual stories. This can lead to some confusion on the characters and the players' part about what is the adventure about. What is the main story of the adventure? We're hearing about wizards here, Duergar here, and Aurel here, and there's no real ties between them. So what I'll try to do in this video is that I'll see how we can tie the stories better together, so that the foreshadowing a more cohesive story. And I want to look at how we can improve the foreshadowing that we already have in the book, and also look at how we can add more foreshadowing or make it more likely that the characters will learn about the things we want them to learn about as they go through Chapter 1. Alright, so how can we tie the story in Chapter 1 10 Towns better together? As I've mentioned a few times now, there's actually three stories in Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden. There's Aurel and her everlasting Rime, there's Sardarok and his Duergar, and then there's the Arcane Brotherhood and their search for the lost city of Itherin. If we can tie these stories better together, we can create a more cohesive story that'll also be easier for us to foreshadow, since learning about the Duergar also means learning about the greater plot which the Arcane Brotherhood and Aurel and her frost druids are also involved with. To me, this starts and ends with Aurel and Itherin. These are the two most important things in the story. Aurel is the most important because she's the antagonist of the adventure, she's the main villain, she's the big boss, she's the big evil. And then there's Itherin, which is where the adventure will end up. It's the final location, it's the treasure the characters are looking for. Okay, so how can we tie the three stories together so they revolve around Itherin? One way to do this is to have Aurel's everlasting Rime actually be a response to the Arcane Brotherhood's search for Itherin. There's several ways you can set this up, so what I'm proposing here is simply one way to do it. But what I'm thinking is that a few years back, the wizard Valis Gant from the Arcane Brotherhood came to Icewind Dale. He had other motives here, he had an evil plan of his own. All of this is detailed in the playtest adventure Legacy of the Crystal Shard, but that's not too important. What is important is that while Valis Gant was here, Aurel the Frostmaiden learned about the Arcane Brotherhood and learned, more importantly, that they had discovered Ithrin's existence. Now, Itherin is this ancient nether-reach necropolis that Aurel has hidden away under the Wrecked Glacier. It's part of Aurel's persona that she's very enamored with lost treasures and hidden beauty, and she wants to keep this beauty preserved. And Itherin is amongst her most prized possessions. So, when she learns that the Arcane Brotherhood is looking for this ancient city and is trying to uncover it, she reacts. So what she does is she creates this everlasting render to deter the wizards from looking for Itherin. This works for a while because the wizards are waiting for summer to arrive so they can head up and mount an expedition in full force. Eventually, some of the wizards grew tired of waiting, and a handful of wizards have arrived in Icewind Dale looking for Itherin. This has caused Aurel to ramp up her efforts to stop them. She's ordered her frost druids to go around 10 towns increasing desperation and making the people of 10 towns flock to worship her. She encourages human sacrifice and all these other things we're reading about in the first chapter. In addition, she's also reached out to the Duergar and gotten their assistance. Now, whether Auril is actually behind the Duergar coming to the surface, perhaps she whispered in Asmodeus' ears that servants of Levistus, another archdevil, has come to Icewind Dale and that he should move to stop them. Or perhaps it's her who's whispered directly to Sardarok, either posing as his deity or simply whispering in his ear that there's a settlement ripe for conquest on the surface and which is now conveniently covered in darkness. Whichever is the case, Sardarok and his Duergar come to the surface and are intent on destroying 10 towns, which plays directly into Auril's hands. What we do here is then we create a tangible alliance between Sardarok and his Duergar, Auril and her Frost Druids, against the Arcane Brotherhood. This alliance is pretty basic. The Frost Druids and their awakened animals help gather Charterlin, this black crystal substance, from around Icewind Dale and giving it to the Duergar, while the Duergar in turn use their invisibility or their ability to disguise themselves as regular dwarves to go around 10 towns and keep an eye on the Arcane Brotherhood and their progress. They can then report back to the Frost Druids, who can try to stop them and have perhaps in some cases already been successful in stopping individual wizards. We can make this alliance clear to the party by having the Frost Druids and the Duergar exchange messages, perhaps through awakened birds or other animals who are flying across Icewind Dale, delivering messages about when's the next shipment of Charterlin coming, or where is the wizard from the Arcane Brotherhood and what are they doing. By tying the three factions together this way, Auril and her Frost Druids, Sardarok and his Duergar in alliance against the Arcane Brotherhood, trying to prevent them from fighting Uthring, while also trying to destroy 10 towns and drive the people of 10 towns to worship Auril. We have created a singular story that revolves around Uthrin and Auril's everlasting rhyme. This means that if the characters just encounter perhaps a Frost Druid or a Duergar or a member of the Arcane Brotherhood, they should be able to at least get hints at the other two factions, the other two storylines, as well as the main storyline, which is, in the end, ending Auril's everlasting rhyme by finding the Mythala in Uthrin. Next up, let's take a look at how we can enhance the foreshadowing that is already described in the book. As mentioned previously, there's basically 5 towns where the characters can get some direct foreshadowing. In Bremen, they can speak with an awakened Plesiosaurus to learn more about the Frost Druids. In Lonelywood, they can encounter a Frost Druid and speak with awakened plants and animals to learn more about Auril and her Frost Druids. In Carconic, Cardinval, and Easthaven, they can encounter Duergar who can also inform them about Sardarok and his evil plans. In Easthaven and Cardinval, they can also encounter or at least hear about members of the Arcane Brotherhood and their search for Icewind. If we start in Bremen, we can enhance the foreshadowing here by making sure that the characters actually get it. This means not making a straight combat encounter out of the characters meeting with the Plesiosaurus, but making sure that they get a chance to speak with the Plesiosaurus and hear what information it has. We can also then have it point directly to Lonelywood, as it describes how the Frost Druid that awakened it lives in the woods across the lake. In Lonelywood, we can have the locals describe how a Frost Druid, in this case Vernis, Ravisen's deceased sister, came through town a few weeks or months ago, urging the locals to begin making human sacrifices to Auril. The locals refused, and perhaps some of them got so angry that they killed the druid. Whether or not you want to give the characters this information straight up or want to keep it more hidden is up to you. We'll go over in more detail as we cover Lonelywood how this could look, but in any event, this informs the players straight away that there are Frost Druids in the area. In the Elven Tomb itself, the characters probably won't have much opportunity to speak with Ravisen, but we want to make sure that they get the story anyway. The book has an awakened shrub here that can tell them, but if the awakened shrub isn't present or they've already killed it, you want to make sure that another awakened plant or animal takes its place, giving the characters the information they're looking for. If you're using the alliance between the Frost Druids and the Duergar, this is also a great place to set that up. You can have a pile of Charterlin be present in the Elven Tomb. You can then have an awakened plant or animal or whatever the characters are speaking to inform them that the druid had ordered them to take this Charterlin southward to the Grey Ones in a few days. This ties the Frost Druids and the Duergar together and also foreshadows the Duergar's presence before the characters get to Carconic if they haven't been there yet. In Carconic we can do the same but in reverse, as any Duergar the characters interrogate can inform them that Frost Druids are bringing Charterlin in deliveries and that such a delivery was supposed to be made in a couple of days. These deliveries come in, dragged by awakened wolves or other animals at your discretion. We can also further cement this alliance between the Duergar and the Frost Druids by having Nildar leave a small note on his desk, reminding him that he's supposed to tell the Frost Druids animals about a potential member of the Arcane Brotherhood holed up in Cardinal. This will also make it more likely that the characters actually investigate Cardinal instead of just going through the town. In Cardinal itself, we don't need to make a lot of changes. We can of course make it more likely that the characters actually go to the care by giving them information about it as they go through the town. The only thing we will want to change about the information that's given in Cardinal is that if they speak to Hithen, this old soothsayer who has a lot of information about what's going on, she'll also make sure to inform them that the Frost Druids and Duergar are working together, although she doesn't know exactly what they are working together at. Lastly, in East Haven, we can have Dirth, the Duergar there, have a bit more information at hand. This could be in the form of 2 separate letters. You can use either or both, depending on which way you want to take things. This could be a letter from the Frost Druids thanking Dirth for informing about a ship coming into 10 towns carrying a member of the Arcane Brotherhood. This could be Naslantomir, and describing how they successfully sunk the ship and stopped her from arriving. There could also be an unfinished letter in common which Dirth was writing as the characters arrive on the ferry to interrupt him, where he describes that the wizard Desan was burned at the stake and that he's no longer a threat to the Frost Druids and their plans. The exact details of these letters, as well as how you can present them, is something we will go over in more detail as we cover East Haven specifically. So even though we don't go into the full details here, I hope you can see how by making these minor tweaks and tying the stories just a bit more together, we're making sure that the characters will unravel more foreshadowing if they just pick up on one of the threads of foreshadowing we have around, and that they'll also get an understanding of the various factions and their role in the adventure. The last thing I want to go over is how we can add in extra foreshadowing, because as I mentioned in the start of this video, the way 10 Towns is set up as a sandbox, it's not entirely sure that the characters will actually run into the foreshadowing that is described in the book. We can of course do some things to make it more likely by adding in a bit of structure and tying the stories together as described in this video, but in the end the characters might still skip across most of the important foreshadowing we have in there for them. So what we can do is create some scenarios that we can place in any town at any time. Once again, we want to foreshadow Auril and her Frost Druids, Zadok and his Duergar, and the Arcane Brotherhood and their search for Ithrin. We can foreshadow the Arcane Brotherhood and their search for Ithrin, and Velin in particular, because she's an important NPC that the characters will know virtually nothing about before chapter 3 or 4. We can do this by having Velin seek the characters out early. This could be by making her the quest giver for the starting quest Nature Spirits, which is something we will cover in the next video as we go over the starting quests and how you can start the adventure. But we can also just have Velin seek out the party early on in the adventuring, asking them to perhaps keep a lookout for her friend Naslantomir, who has an object she's looking for. Naslantomir being the wizard that's shipwrecked off of Auril's abode. Whether or not this quest can actually lead to anything, or the characters just get a chance to meet Velin, the important thing here is that the characters realize that there are these wizards in 10 Towns and that they are looking for something. You can also foreshadow the Arcane Brotherhood and Desan in his search for Ithrin by having locals at a tavern talk about that crazy wizard who wanted to look for ancient ruins out in the wilderness and how the adventurers that went with him hasn't come back yet. Or you can even have Desan put out a message seeking adventurers to help him, but when the characters respond and go to look for Desan, he's nowhere to be found, and he apparently already found someone to go look for the lost spire of Netheril. In any event, just hearing about Desan and his search for the lost spire of Netheril will make the events at East Haven later, where Desan is burned at the stake, so much more meaningful or impactful to the characters. As for Auril and her Frost Druids, what I would suggest is that you have the sacrifices be tied more closely to the Frost Druids. The human sacrifices are the direct consequence of the Frost Druids growing around 10 Towns, asking the citizens of 10 Towns to make sacrifices to Auril. In the first town the characters arrive in, where they are making human sacrifices to Auril, you can describe how there's a pole in the center of town with a young woman tied to it. She's been frozen to death for several days, and the characters may inquire, or you can have some locals nearby loudly proclaim that it's such a pity that this young woman had to die, and maybe they don't agree with the sacrifice, blaming the Frost Druid that came through town a few months ago for the whole affair. This both gives a bit more meaning and impact to the whole sacrificing to a real thing, but also describes how these druids are tied to the greater plot and how Auril is actively doing stuff to harm the citizens of 10 Towns. You could even have the Frostwood leave a whole trail of breadcrumbs spanning back a few months, where it first went through Targos, convincing them to perform human sacrifices before going up to Bremen and not succeeding there, the same in Tourmaline, where the citizens objected to the practice, and finally going to Lonelywood, where the Frost Druid, Vernus, was killed by the locals for continually suggesting that they should make these human sacrifices. This is something we'll cover in a bit more detail as we go through the individual towns, but the idea here is just that we make the human sacrifices very apparent to the characters, and we also tie them directly to Auril and Frost Druids, and also make it more likely that the characters will seek out these Frost Druids, or at least consider them to be a factor. Finally, there's the Duergar. I think that this is perhaps the most important thing we need to foreshadow, simply because Chapter 3 and 4 function so much better if the characters know about the Duergar before heading in there. As mentioned previously, there's ways we can do this by tying the Duergar together with the Frost Druid, so that meeting Ravicing in Lonelywood will also lead them to Carconic. But if the characters for some reason aren't going to Carconic or Easthaven or so on their own, you can always have Duergar trail them in the streets, perhaps invisibly leaving trails or trying to steal a piece of charlatan the characters picked up from one of the other quest locations. Whichever way you do it, having the characters meet a Duergar, perhaps get an opportunity to interrogate them and learn where the Duergar hold up, whether that is in Carconic, Cardinval, or Easthaven, whichever one you want them to go to, is an important way we can foreshadow Sardarok and his plans before the characters get into Chapter 3 and 4. And it's something you can literally place in any town in 10 Towns. Lastly, we need to also be aware that the quests in 10 Towns can all be moved. If the characters for some reason just don't want to go to Carconic, you can always just take all the events of Carconic and move them to Cardinval. Or you can take the Easthaven ferry and place it up in Bremen. You can do whatever you want, so that it doesn't matter where the characters go, they will end up getting the foreshadowing that we want them to get. Of course, this is a last resort, as we want to make as few changes to the adventures written as possible, because it's just easier to play that way. But it's good to know that you always have the option to simply just move quests, move locations, move encounters, whichever way you want to. Alright, so that wraps up this video on story and foreshadowing in Chapter 1, 10 Towns. In the next video, we'll go over the 2 starting quests for the adventure, and also look at how we can use them to foreshadow and structure the events of Chapter 1. As always, I'd like to thank our patrons for their support, you for watching and for liking and subscribing if you're into doing that sort of stuff. And if you want to know more, you can visit eventyrgames.com, where we write articles and also have written articles about running Rime the Frostmaiden. You can also check out our products on the DM's Guild. There's links to those below. And if you just want some cool maps for running the adventure, including Chapter 1, 10 Towns, you can also check out a link to the Frostmaiden map pack in the description below. Either way, thank you for getting this far, and I hope to see you in the next video, and may you have a great time running Rime of the Frostmaiden.